Since research has shown that mandatory minimum sentencing does not deter future crime, what makes you, as Prime Minister, believe this is still an effective way of prosecuting criminals?
So we have been, since we've come into office, trying to toughen up our laws and make sure that crimes are appropriate. You know, for example, we think that if people commit serious crimes, violent crimes, we don't think it's appropriate that they would serve their sentence at home. What's called conditional sentences, effectively house arrest. And we don't think it's appropriate that very serious or repeat crimes would not be subject to at least some kind of minimum penalty, minimum prison time. I mean, surely, if a crime is serious enough, a murder charge, for example, there should be some prison time for a murder charge. So these are the kinds of changes we've been making over time. They've been very well supported by the Canadian public. I don't want to say crime is out of control in this country, but we do know that there have been some very worrying growth areas, particularly if you look at the areas of guns, gangs, and drugs. But we do think it's very important that the criminal justice system send a strong message that such behavior is not acceptable and that it be appropriately punished. Because what we do know about deterrence is it doesn't work unless people are actually certain they're going to get punished. But if you create a system where there's always a loophole and you can always get out of the punishment, or the punishment can always be downgraded or forgotten, then it's clear that kind of a system does not deter people. I'm not an expert in this area, I'm not an expert in this area, I'm not an expert in this area, I'm not an expert in this area.
In 1986, I was counsel to the committee that wrote the mandatory minimums that we enacted. Our prison population grew from 36,000 in 1986 to 200,000 today. That's been an enormous expense at more than $25,000 per person per year. It's costing us billions of dollars. It costs much more than the government estimated. It sends a message to the judiciary of contempt by the legislature. It says, we don't trust you. We don't have confidence in your judgment to impose appropriate sentences for serious offenders. And by creating these mandatory sentences, it means that sometimes low-level offenders, minor offenders, who trigger the quantitative threshold get sentenced to the longer sentences that higher-level offenders were targets for. It certainly didn't have any positive effect here in the United States in reducing the availability of drugs. The price of the drugs continued to go down. In fact, we passed these laws in 1986, and our crack cocaine epidemic grew steadily for about the next 5 or 6 years. So there isn't evidence, looking at drug use in the United States today, that these mandatory minimums played a positive role. When you have a commodity that is outlawed, such as marijuana, it means that no one who's involved in the production or distribution has the protection of law. If you have an employment problem, you solve that with violence. You can't fire somebody. You fire somebody, they can rat you out. You can't contest some dispute over the quality of goods. You can't go into court and sue for breach of contract. None of the protections that all businesses have that are lawful exist in these criminal matters. So you end up with the most violent people being able to dominate these organizations or dominate these businesses. We learned with alcohol prohibition in this country in the 1920s, it leads to more violence and disaster and ultimately does not protect public health or safety. Mandatory minimums take the discretion away from judges to impose just sentences in low-level cases. You have to assume that the judges are going to prosecute the judges are going to punish the heads of these organizations harshly. The maximum sentences go up to life. So there's a great deal of room to punish the high-level offenders already. You don't have to set minimums that end up catching little fish and sentencing as though they're kingpins. LEAP believes that we really need to legalize and regulate the production and distribution and use of these drugs. That I think we've had a 40-year experiment that shows we get more crime and we don't get the public safety benefit. As former cops, prosecutors, judges, we understand that what we're doing isn't working, and it puts the lives of law enforcement officers needlessly at risk. We think that a system of regulation and control gives us all the tools that we need to protect public safety.